Well, welcome everybody to the IEF Oil Market Security Review with S&P Global Platts. There's never a dull moment in global energy markets that are top of the minds of ministers, industries, and households. It's really great that we have S&P Global Platts as a partner with the IEF in these two sessions that will highlight S&P Global Platts work and views, followed by IEF perspectives, together with those of distinguished energy experts who have kindly agreed to join us today with these panels. I'd also like to express my appreciation to Andy Critchlow and his colleagues at S&P Global Platts and Yvonne Martin from ISADE for co-moderating these sessions. Thanks also go out to Cornelia Meyer, Pedro Moraz Salamanca, and my good friend Herman Wang, of course, for their support of the IEF Energy Dialogue that has never been more relevant and dynamic. As we meet today, markets are sending us signals about supply and demand. With this town hall meeting, we hope to update you on rebalancing and deepen the understanding of existing oil market security mechanisms, from investment, storage, and spare capacity to data transparency, safe passage, and resiliency. So dear Andy, thanks for joining, and the floor is yours to introduce the findings of the S&P Global Platts Oil Security Sentinel project and introduce your colleagues from S&P Platts. Andy.
Thanks very much, Joe. Really appreciate the opportunity. We're all honored here at S&P Global Platts to be invited to participate in this forum. And you know, I think I can speak for everyone here as part of the S&P Global Platts panel. My colleague, Chief Geopolitical Risk Analyst, Paul Sheldon in New York, and my colleague in London, Paul Hickin, our EMEA oil news lead, that we'd love to be in Riyadh at the moment and to join you. And we look forward to the time that we can actually do that. So I've pulled together a few slides to show you and walk you through what the actual Oil Security Sentinel project is. I'm going to share this with you now. I'm hoping that technology doesn't fail me at this point. Just one second. Hopefully you can all see this. The Oil Security Sentinel really started as a project about a year ago, when through our reporting at S&P Global Platts, we started to really realize that there was a demonstrable uptick in security-related incidents really focused on the Middle East and the Arabian Gulf region. And one of the things that we've really led with over the last 3 years at Platts is using data analytics, using data visualization to tell a story, to try and add some insight into our traditional reporting of these events, our price analysis of these events, and our analytical research around these events. And so we've decided to bring that all together into the Oil Security Sentinel as an attempt to really kind of understand what was happening in the region, what was happening around oil security, and to make it as compelling and visually interactive and usable as possible for the industry, for market participants, and for experts like everyone participating today in this forum. So what exactly is it? So this is a data GPS mapping project where we have plotted individual incidents targeting oil infrastructure or shipping, primarily in the Arabian Gulf and Arabian Peninsula, and visualize those incidents so you can see where they are, what infrastructure physically was targeted in these individual incidents, how much oil resources, commodities was actually at stake. Has there been a price impact? What was the mode of attack? Was it intercepted? Was it successful? And we've come up with some really startling findings as a consequence of this project, which we believe is a first. And it's a first because, as you can see from this slide, we've used open source data that's based on our proprietary reporting at S&P Global Platts. I lead a team of 23 reporters and editors across EMEA. We have a great bureau in the Middle East based in Dubai, supported by a network of regional correspondents. So, you know, we're a great sentinel, as it were, to pick up on the geopolitical temperature of the region, but also to join the dots between these events and to join the dots to see whether they actually have an impact on price, whether the risk premium still exists, and make some sense of this for markets. The focus, as I said before, is on the Gulf region, but we do intend to expand this project out as we go forward and look at other types of disruption and events that can impact our markets. Now, these could be weather related, it could be hurricanes, it could be to do with sanctions. And the next slide that I'll get to will explain a little bit around that. However, we've also included in the analysis some deep dive into what's happening in Iran around sanctions and that impact on capacity and supply to the markets, Venezuela, Nigeria, a different set of security issues facing the oil industry historically in Nigeria, and also the importance of transit choke points, which have become increasingly in focus as a consequence of the uptick in security events that we've plotted as a consequence of doing this project. And we plan to update this quarterly so that we'll give the market an idea of where geopolitical risk, primarily in the Arabian Peninsula, is trending. Is it trending up? Has the situation calmed down over a period? So we want this to be an ongoing project that provides a lot of value for the market. So as I said, geopolitical risk, there's nothing new here. This is something certainly anyone who's been following oil markets since 2000, which is incidentally when I actually got into energy journalism originally, will have seen one of the purveying themes throughout has been risk and geopolitical risk, whether that's to do with some of the political turmoil we're seeing in Venezuela, which has had a big impact on direct production from that region, whether it's been US hurricanes, which actually more than any of the geopolitical risk events that we've seen has had a bigger impact. And we've seen that recently, although we reference here Katrina, we've seen that very recently with the slow rebuild back from Hurricane Ida, which hit the US a couple of months back. Militancy in Nigeria, as I mentioned before, this has been an ongoing theme for the last 21 years and is expected to continue in that way. Libya has been a great unknown since the uprising and the toppling of the previous regime of Muammar Gaddafi. The uncertainty over Libyan production has been a key unknown for oil markets to weigh and measure. But then the wider Middle East risk impact. Obviously, the major attack that was targeted on the Abqaiq oil facility in some ways took us all the way back to the 1980s and the tanker war and the fear that there could be this heart attack moment from one individual incident targeting a major facility like Abqaiq. But when we look at price, actually, the comparisons start to break down a little bit. Now, the main visualization factor behind the Sentinel, and when I get to the end of the presentation, I show you the links that you can go in, navigate it, manipulate the tool. There's lots of data in there, lots of ways to slice and dice it so you can see it. But the main visual aspects of it is this comparison between 2017, 2018, and 2021. And these roundels that you will see represent individual attacks on infrastructure. And as you can see, in 2018, we start off with a few attacks really focused on the border with Yemen in Jazan, targeting the refinery. And then when we shoot forward to 2021, we see this explosion of attacks that have happened and incidents specifically in this year. So we plotted 61 security incidents reported by the Platts team over this period, and that to date now, it's a 575% increase in physical attacks over that period. The incidents are widening, which shows a greater sophistication to whichever agents or entities are perpetrating these incidents. They're also targeting a wider spectrum of physical infrastructure as opposed to just targeting refineries. We now see targeting on shipping. We now see pipelines being targeted, upstream facilities. When you go into the Sentinel, the various color codes on these two graphical representations here actually represent a different type of infrastructure. So we've really drilled down into this detail to present it to you in a way that I don't think that you will really have seen before. And in the first 9 months of 2021, we've seen 28 attacks on oil infrastructure. And with so much going on in the world at the moment, whether it's recovery from the pandemic, policy around OPEC, which direction the group takes in terms of returning supply to the market, it's really been forgotten that actually you have an unprecedented period of geopolitical risk attacks in the Arabian Gulf targeting oil infrastructure. And we've broken that down a little bit more for you, which I'm going to go through next. Of course, we can't discount the impact of Abqaiq on the region. It was, quite rightly described as potentially the heart attack moment for oil in the region. But one of the startling things is that actually, if you wind back to '84 and the tanker war, we had a tripling in oil prices. When we look at Abqaiq, oil prices increased by 13%. By the end of the week, we were back to where we'd started. Now, spare capacity has a big part to play there. The resilience of Saudi Arabia's oil infrastructure and its preparedness to respond very quickly has a huge part to play there. The response of the international community, again, and all these factors weren't present in markets in the 80s, which kind of demonstrates why it was very different and the response was very different in terms of price and outcome. But then when we look at these attacks as well, we see that there's no longer a risk premium. When I covered OPEC more closely as a reporter back in 2007, 2006, 2008, the run up to the $147 a barrel peak that we saw then, oil ministers in the region would frequently say to me that $25 in the price is risk premium. It was repeatedly given as an excuse, a reason for high oil prices. But what we've seen over the last 5 years, that despite this increase in prices, the risk premium has actually reduced. Now, some of this has to do with the resilience of the industry in the region to weather the storm. Although there's been a lot of attacks, there's been a minimal supply disruption. So our average over the 5-year period shows that only 130,000 barrels a day of oil has actually been displaced from the region. And if you exclude the Abqaiq incident, these attacks have been frequent, yes, but low intensity, often designed to shock as opposed to cause significant damage. They've also coincided with a period of weak fundamentals and high inventories, and my next slide will talk to that a little bit better. US shale and the diversity of supply has also made a big part in insulating world oil markets from this difficult time. However, Asia, consumers in China, Japan, and India are increasingly more exposed as we see more crude from the region going into these Asian markets. And my colleague Herman Wang, who leads our Middle East coverage and leads our OPEC coverage, is going to talk a little bit about that in his slides later in the day. But what is clear from our tracker is that these attacks are now asymmetric. Now, this chart on the right-hand side, I think, is really interesting because the 61 attacks that we reported on, we drilled into the data a little bit more. Because in each attack, we'll report, what's actually physically been attacked, where it's been attacked, when it happened, what was involved, whether it was successful in terms of being intercepted, or whether, unfortunately, the mode of attack succeeded in terms of hitting the target. And actually, by analyzing this data within the stories, we found actually that only 40% of the time, mitigation measures were successful in intercepting hostile attacks on oil infrastructure in the region. So 55% success rate. Describing it to a colleague earlier this week, I said, well, if it was a vaccine, it wouldn't be very successful. Now, it doesn't tell the whole story, however. You've got to go to this next slide to look at that. When we broke down the reporting of the stories, we found that 92% of the missile attacks were targeted at Saudi Arabia. However, the mitigation measures that Saudi Arabia has in place to defend its oil infrastructure, which is very well advanced, very well funded, have been remarkably successful in intercepting missile attacks. They have been less successful in intercepting drone attacks. And the segments of this pie chart that you see marked UAV, that's unmanned aerial vehicle, and USV, which is unmanned surface vehicle, which is basically an unmanned boat. These represent drones, and as you can see, they now account for the majority of attacks on oil infrastructure in the region. And the problem with that is that defense systems seem to find it harder, based on our analysis of the reporting that we've done, to intervene and intercept these attacks. Of the 52% of incidents using UAVs and USV drones were reported as hits. And I think that's a really important piece of data, because the threat has changed. Also, another thing that we've observed is the growth in the use of what are known as lateral sea mines, limpet mines, for most people. And these have resulted in an 80% success rate in terms of hits. But again, high frequency, low impact, because very little oil, if any, has hit the water at this point. And 22% of the attacks in the kingdom have been directed at the Jazan refinery on the border with Yemen. Now, this chart here talks really to this issue of why the risk premium has been moderated, and the impact of the risk premium in oil prices has been somewhat subdued, given this Cold War, for want of a better term, that has been waging in the background in terms of the volume of attacks on oil infrastructure. And what it's showing you is the spread of Platts Dubai, Platts Brent, against the physical attacks that have happened in the region, if you toggle over it. And in the background, these blue bars here represent spare capacity. And earlier in the slide, I said that there's been certain circumstances that have coincided with this ramp up in attacks, which were out of the oil market's control. And that's primarily been the pandemic, because that has coincided with this big buildup in spare capacity in inventories as a consequence of the slowdown in global demand. And that has definitely played an impact in, to a certain extent, insulating oil markets during this period of quite profound volatility, when we've seen 28 individual incidents targeting oil and shipping in the Arabian Gulf alone in 2021, the first 9 months. And on that note, I would encourage everyone who has called in today to go and check out the Oil Security Sentinel. You can find it at platts.com. The URL is there. I'm very happy to share that and these slides with anyone on the call today. This is all publicly disclosed information. All the information that we've used here for the security tracker is based on our proprietary reporting. I'd also like to just flag the team behind this project, specifically Paul Hickey, who's on the call today, and our colleague Aklavia Gupta, who I don't think was able to join us today, who is in India at the moment. But without their focus, this wouldn't have happened. We think this is going to be a great tool for oil markets going forward, provide a lot of insight into an area of oil markets which has always been a little bit murky. We think we're going to provide a lot of clarity there for market participants, analysts, the community around energy, and we'd welcome your feedback. So I'm happy to take questions now, but I've got my colleague, the brains of the operation, Paul Sheldon, lined up to add his view on what I've just presented as well.
Thanks a lot, Andy.
I'll stop sharing, hand over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I will see if I can share just a few things I put together. So hopefully you can see that. And so, yeah, and it was just interesting for me to sit here and watch, you go through this tool. So just for perspective, my name is Paul Sheldon, and I work on Platts Analytics. I'm responsible for the OPEC supply forecast, which of course, geopolitical risk, in addition to OPEC policy, are really the key factors behind how we, forecast this market and these supply volumes. And looking at this Sentinel tool, you look back, disruptions, obviously you never know when they're going to happen. You never know when these events are going to happen. And so when they do, everyone just starts scrambling. What volumes are at risk? What volumes are affected? What does it mean? What's the history of this? And the Sentinel, I think, puts a lot of these sort of uncertainties that market participants and forecasters and analysts, have really been unable to get with a quick Google search, when all of a sudden, some pipeline got hit, an area, you don't even know where it is in the world, in a lot of times. So I think this puts a lot of, history and volumes and everything into context. I think that a lot of people are looking for. So I think it's an extremely valuable tool. And then the map aspect is extremely valuable. And so for me, as an OPEC supply forecaster, I sort of take all these risks and disruptions and try to put them into a volumetric perspective. How do they affect our balances and how do they affect our forecasts? And so it's not an easy answer, of course, but the most sort of translatable way to do this is through supply disruptions. And so I chose to show you this slide because this is since 2010, since the Arab Spring and Iran sanctions and the Libyan civil war started really affecting markets in 2010, 2011, and 2012 until today, and sort of see the path. And you can sort of see a lot of the tensions and the risks that Andy was talking about here. You see Nigerian insurgencies in 2016, of course, Iran sanctions, which we'll talk about more. Libya's civil war, as volumes kind of go on and off, almost seemingly like flipping a switch. 1 million barrels a day can be gone within a week or so. But perhaps more importantly, because as interesting it is to see, what has happened with disruptions, where they are currently, what does that mean for our forecasts? And especially right now, where there's so many uncertainties overhanging the market, what's going to happen with geopolitics in 2022? What sort of volumes can we count on coming back, and what volumes are there that could potentially go away? And so what I find interesting now is that disruptions have come off the high since the Abqaiq attack in 2019. Libya is producing near full capacity, and so if you look, really the by far the largest factor affecting supply volumes is U.S. foreign policy and sanctions in particular. Sanctions on Iran and to a lesser degree Venezuela, and this really is the overwhelming majority of supply that's offline for geopolitical reasons. And so our forecast for 2022, we anticipate that a lot of these volumes are going to come back, and admittedly, that is an extremely uncertain prospect. And so I look at this and I find it bullish, or at least a bullish risk, for two reasons. First of all, you never know what's going to happen with Iran and U.S. nuclear talks. And secondly, we're not really counting on any major supply disruptions. As OPEC production comes back and spare capacity falls, our forecast assumes Libya stays above 1 million barrels a day. We assume that Nigeria is able to grow close to where they were before OPEC production cuts happen. We're assuming that nothing happens with Iran and Israel. A lot of these sort of risks. We're assuming that none of these Houthi attacks on Saudi Arabia actually hit the spot that they're targeting. And so I think you need to sort of look at that from two perspectives. U.S. sanctions, of course, are the biggest factor, and U.S. and Iran in particular. And I'm sure everyone is sort of reading the tea leaves every week when our talks going to resume and this sort of thing. So our reference case does assume that they will come to a deal next year. In our reference case, we have to put it in our reference case at some point. So we're assuming sanctions relief in April, and that full sanctions relief allows them to essentially grow 1 million barrels a day or so within a few months in the second quarter. Now, the odds are certainly far less than they were in May and June when the talks were really heating up and before the election. So our really conviction level isn't that far above 50-50. And so it's sort of looking at, even in a case where the current President Biden, he specifically criticized sanctions on Iran. He criticized sanctions on Venezuela. He wanted to take them off, but yet they're still here 9 months later. And sanctions from a political perspective are extremely sticky. They're much easier to implement than they are to take off because of political constraints. And so we can't count on Iranian volumes coming back to the market next year. And then that leads us to our sort of second bullish risk overhanging markets, which is not our reference case. We're assuming that Iran starts to come back, that OPEC is able to meet demand growth, and that there isn't a major outage somewhere else. But as everyone knows who's been following OPEC, disruptions are unpredictable in their timing and their scope, but they are certain. You just don't know when they're going to happen, how much volumes are going to be affected. So these are the real risks that we're sort of looking at going into next year. And then just to the final point on sanctions, I mean, Andy was sort of talking about risk premium, spare capacity and inventories. So just looking at this through the prism of U.S. policy on Iran, when the sanctions first went into effect in 2012, the Obama administration was extremely worried that the market would not be able to handle, these sanctions on Iran. And the EIA, had to put out a report every 60 days to say that, oil markets are sufficiently supplied in order to maintain these sanctions. So then you switch to 2018, when the Trump administration reimposed these sanctions, and they specifically cited U.S. shale as a reason that, that they can put the pressure on Iran. And so the difference was quite dramatic, and it was a different price environment during both those periods. So the question is, where are we heading into 2022? Which one is it? Can the market handle Iran sanctions, or can the market, potentially not handle it without going to another price level higher? And so the question really is spare capacity, as Andy mentioned. So we're sort of looking at where is spare now, and where is it from a historical perspective. So we see, OPEC has started to come back, and in a big way, starting in August with 400,000 barrels a day per month. The unilateral Saudi cut came back. So spare capacity is falling, but it's not low. It's actually relatively high if you look at from a perspective since 2003. And certainly much higher than it was in 2003, much higher than it was in 2011. But those were higher price environments. And we're sort of heading down to a more normal spare capacity level where, below 3 million barrels a day of overnight spare capacity, and almost all of it concentrated in core OPEC. We call core OPEC plus now, which is Saudi Arabia, Russia, UAE, and Kuwait. And then there's a little bit in Iraq, although there are questions about how quickly Iraq could get back to pre-cut levels. And so there is a risk as you get back to those normal levels. There wasn't, Abcake is certainly an exception, but balances were loosening. OPEC was actually cutting production in 2018, and they had to cut production again in the first quarter of 2020. And sort of a lot of interesting nuances going on with why price reacted very quickly and then came off after the Abcake attacks. But if you look at the large disruptions, in OPEC's history, spare capacity was at a much higher level. In 1979 and before the Iraq War, before the Gulf War in 1990, before the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, and even before, Iran sanctions went into effect in 2011. So this just sort of highlights the risk. Again, it's not a reference case. And I, as a sort of geopolitical and supply analyst, we'll talk to clients and to people all the time. And geopolitics is always something that, people want to talk about. It's interesting and it's important. But they really pay much closer attention to what I'm saying when spare capacity is low and when markets are thin. So when markets barely flinched when tankers were hijacked in the Gulf over the summer, but we had spare capacity at 5 or 6 million barrels a day. So ultimately, the worst case scenario wasn't that bad from a market perspective. But as you get down to sort of more historically normal levels, and then even below that, which really does depend on whether it's an Iran deal or not, how low is OPEC spare capacity going to go? Geopolitics become much more important, and you can look at it for the demand for inventory goes up. People get worried if even if the disruption hasn't happened yet, if you're looking like much higher odds of a disruption, people raise their demand for inventory, and that probably increases the risk premium that Andy was talking about. And so I just want to switch to look at it from a different perspective. Now, again, this isn't our reference case, but markets do have to be prepared for a scenario in which there is no Iran deal and these volumes don't come back to the market. And if demand continues to grow, as our reference case assumes in the wake of the COVID demand recovery, OPEC is going to be forced to meet all this demand growth. There really is no other supply that's immediately available. We can talk about U.S. shale, we can talk about some other non-OPEC projects and FIDs, but U.S. shale is in a different place than it was in 2018. There's capital discipline going on, certainly among the larger companies. Yes, if we move to a higher level, there probably will be increased activity. But this is not true spare capacity, and there's a 3 to 6 month lag between an increased activity and a sort of resulting increase in volumes. And so what you really have to look at from a geopolitical perspective is what can OPEC do? How quickly can they meet the production? How long could they keep it online? So we're now looking at spare capacity. So what I showed you before was a higher spare capacity volume, and that is what we think that OPEC could do sort of in an overnight short-term supply disruption response. So, we think they'll be at about 3.5 million barrels a day of headline spare capacity by the end of this year. And, they could do this for a few months, but if there truly is, no Iran deal, if demand continues to grow and we don't see non-OPEC growth like we've seen in previous cycles, we're now looking at what we call sustainable spare capacity. And this is, what could be kept online, in perpetuity? What could they bring online and keep there? How comfortable would Saudi Arabia producing above 11 million barrels a day? would they do it for a year? We look at history, and again, this is an estimate. So we think that by July 2022, after a couple more production increases, even assuming an Iran deal is reached in April, that sustainable spare will probably be around 2 million barrels a day or even lower. And this is, the difference being, we think Saudi would probably be comfortable producing close to 11 million barrels a day, but not where they produce in April 2020. We don't think they would want to do that for, much longer period of time. So just sort of looking at what could trigger a higher price environment than what we're forecasting. And so spare, even the sustainable spare is sufficient to cover a no Iran deal. But at that point, you're looking at some relatively thin, much tighter markets where geopolitics become much more influential. And we sort of isolate on the right, potential risks to our forecast. And this is, Andy was talking about hurricanes and freeze-offs, as well as no Iran deal, as well as Nigeria, not necessarily a return of insurgency, although problems are, Nigeria has some instability issues that we are watching. And Libya, we have an election coming up. So we're not assuming that we're going to lose Libyan volumes, but Libyan volumes have gone down by 1 million barrels a day. So what happens if there's no Iran deal and no Libya? So these are the kind of scenarios that we're playing out in our minds. And these are things that we're sort of watching closely. And until recently, they may have been underappreciated by the market. But again, it's understandable given that spare capacity was at such high levels. But when you look at OPEC plus meeting this demand growth, certainly through the end of the year, there's a question of how long they'll continue with the 400,000 barrel a day monthly increases. But certainly they're going to have to do something more in 2022. The timing is less certain, probably depends on their own internal demand forecasts. But spare capacity is going to continue coming down and potentially probably lower even than we've had in the post-2003 environment. And then finally, the big question, which I think everyone's kind of talked about a lot, and we've covered all the scenarios and all the reasons why we aren't getting closer to an Iran deal. So I just want to sort of show what our reference case forecast assumes. We previously assumed, in May and June, certainly that there would be a deal in the fourth quarter, that it looked like they were heading in that direction. I think a lot of people on the US side thought they were pretty close to a deal, but ultimately they seem even further than ever at this point. And so the volumes at risk are probably worth the attention that we continue to give this one particular issue from a geopolitical perspective. So we can look at, again, like I said before, I think they could grow if you include exports from floating storage. They could probably grow 1 million barrels a day within a few months. And then they could probably grow close to another 1 million barrels a day within the 9 months thereafter. But if there's no sanctions relief, you actually have now the potential for a greater crackdown on the existing Iranian exports to the market. And then you have the follow-on geopolitical impact. Now, we are extremely concerned about Iranian efforts to achieve their regional objectives. We're looking at, of course, Yemen on Saudi Arabia. We're looking at Iraq, where US troops are going to stay, and where a lot of these Iran-backed groups are professing that they want the US out, and they're going to continue to exert pressure in their own way. And then Iran's activities in Lebanon and Syria, where they're looking at Israel in particular. So again, none of these risks are high probability events for a major supply disruption in isolation. But when you put them collectively together, I think that there probably are potentially even underappreciated risks to oil supply next year. And so if there is no Iran deal, now you have to start to look at, what's Israel going to do? They've talked about other options already. They probably certainly not going to sit passively by as enrichment activity continues. So in addition to these volumes that would not come back to the market as a result of a no Iran deal, now you have to look at higher geopolitical risks as a direct result of no Iran deal. And so these are sort of the major market factors that we're looking at. And this was, sort of a high level overview, but I am happy to get into any of these particular volumes that I'm discussing or risks in particular, should anyone be interested. So Andy, that's sort of my talk for now, but I'm happy to again explore anything in greater detail.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I mean, I kind of send it back to Joe really there. I mean, we're happy to take questions, Joe. I hope that people have found that interesting. We can get the slides back up to if anyone's got any specific points that you would like to delve into. I've seen a question there on the chat from Jamie Webster about cyber. I think that's a really great question. It's something actually that we talked about when we did the first edition of the Oil Security Sentinel. Obviously, we had the major cyber attack on the Continental Pipeline in the US. Cyber is a real threat to oil, like it is all commodities, and it's definitely something that we're going to look to do in future updates. I think that in terms of cyber risks to physical infrastructure, we would look to possibly expand it out, because I think that it has a lot of relevance to energy transition, new commodity markets, which are even more exposed than traditional oil markets would be. So that's definitely one that we have on our radar.
Yeah, and I think it's important, Andy, to put that in I mean, cyber is this sort of uncertain, unpredictable space. If you look at Colonial, it seemed like the attacker didn't even understand, the volumetric impact and the market impact of what was going on, and seemed to be some regrets, initially about what had happened. So, this thing can certainly get a life of its own, especially when you're messing with major infrastructure, supplying world markets. It's, I think that is absolutely something that we need to start paying closer attention to.
Okay, thanks for that. I'll just open it up to folks here. Are there any questions in the room here for our panelists? Okay. Well, I will turn the program over to Ivan. No? Oh, the next speaker.
Yes, good evening. Good afternoon, everybody. First, I would like to congratulate the SP Global Platts team for their fantastic presentations. We have been discussing physical risk and their implications, geopolitical risk and the implications of spare capacity. And now we are going to switch a little bit to another kind of risk that previously was not so evident, who is the investment risk, or better say, the lack of investment risk. For many years, IEF and even myself, we have been warning about the huge drop in investments due to the demonization of the oil and gas sector and the potential impact in the prices and in the economy. And now we are seeing the consequences as this is lower than demand growth, and therefore we are facing major issues in the global economy and in certain countries because of the lack of investments in the sector. So what we would like to discuss specifically in this panel is how to maintain energy security and oil investment up in a shrinking market, and what role does ESG play, and how will this affect the security of demand. And in order to address all these issues, we have with us 4 great presenters that will cover the different angles of the issue. The first one will be Christoph, who will present the findings of the IEF report on investment in the oil and gas sector, and we'll discuss whether investment are enough or not. Cornelia will come next to discuss the impact of ESG on the oil and gas investment and how this is reshaping the oil and gas investment rationale. Then Pedro will comment on the level of industry investments and focusing on security of supply. And finally, Herman from SP Global Platts will discuss or will focus on OPEC's long-term game and how it's positioned itself through the ESG movement and with COP26 coming up. So with all these 4 presenters covering all the different potential angles to the issue, I would like to start with Christoph. Christoph is the Director of Energy Dialogue at IEF. And if there is one thing we really need now is dialogue between countries, producing, transit and consuming countries, and also a dialogue between climate, energy and industrial policies. So Christoph.
Thank you very much, Ivan. It's really great that you've agreed to moderate this panel. And let me give you a neutral and dispassionate IEF perspective on what, of course, remains a very precarious multi-market rebalancing act in the oil market after COVID-19 hit the world economy with such unprecedented impacts. Indeed, in December 2020, the IEF released a report on oil and gas investment in the new risk environment, together with the Boston Consulting Group, that has alerted governments of the risk to investment by noting that demand, of course, will outpace supply, and that market volatility, which we indeed have on display today, may slow track a sustainable and inclusive recovery. And the IEF is, of course, also working on an update that we will release later this year. In the context of the G20, we have worked with the G20 member countries part of the Energy Focus Group, established under the presidency of Saudi Arabia. And we continue to track energy supply and demand trends to overcome data gaps, identify risks to underinvestment. And we have proceeded this work under the G20 presidency of Italy as well, for which we've also launched a post-COVID recovery energy monitor. Next slide, please. Yeah, okay. So the key messages that we've evolved from our analysis and interactions with industry and government partners here is that production adjustments and regaining investor confidence is really critical to market stability as demand recovers. The E&P industry's global reset affects supply resiliency probably more than we have thought a year ago. And of course, also the clean technology deployment that we need in the context of the circular carbon economy, the the carbon capture, use and storage investment that we need, that really needs to increase, make a quantum leap forward. And the important point here really is that the industry must remain investable in order to continue to provide security of supply, market stability, and adapt to the climate neutral scenarios that are being adopted. Access to data, of course, is vital, maybe even more important than ESG standards, to reliable price formation that incents the investments in resiliency, enhances energy security, and accelerates these orderly transitions. Next slide, please. Latest data from the IEF post-COVID recovery energy monitor, in which we use alternative metrics for real-time assessments of energy demand, show that the recovery is indeed gaining firmer ground through gasoline and diesel back at 96% of pre-COVID levels, while jet fuel demand is on a steady rise at around 30% below pre-COVID flight levels. Next slide, please. Market rebalancing is really the key here, and that really demands continued collective focus. Latest IEA and OPEC reports on short-term markets show that demand growth will indeed outpace non-OPEC supply by 7 million barrels a day in 2022, while stock levels are falling below five-year averages. And this really places OPEC supply, US shale oil production resilience, and indeed the impact of regulatory initiatives there, as well as available spare capacity front and center in the physical energy market, while ESG and other new regulatory requirements for the oil sector as we move into transition are the metrics to watch in the policy and regulatory environments. Next slide, please. We noted that upstream investment in 2020 dropped by 31% compared to 2019 and will fall by an additional 20% this year. This comes after E&P investment had barely recovered from a drop of 28% in 2015 as a consequence of US shale oil production breaking through on international markets. Moreover, we will need investment to rise by at least 225 billion from 2020 levels to stave off the crisis. And as the update to the report will show, we see these risks further amplified as cost curves steepen on inflationary pressures and supply chain issues and lengthening lead times in a more uncertain investment climate. So energy market stability will become ever more reliant on short cycle investment. Next slide, please. In the context of the G20 Energy Focus Group and the Joint Organizations Data Initiative, we're working, of course, to alleviate data gaps, in particular with respect to inventory data. That tends to be, of course, inversely correlated with price levels. And we're trying to complement that official data with alternative sources and metrics. The key message here is that beyond the data gaps in the non-OECD region, inventories are falling. Next slide, please. Finally, infrastructure is in transition to ensure that existing, often aging, as well as yet to be developed infrastructure can accommodate the decarbonization and demand growth requirements of sustainable development goals, extreme weather events, and other security risks, such as cyber. We really need to invest in greater resiliency, and more focus needs to be placed on investment to overcome these vulnerabilities and fortify systems. Redundancies, I think, have been lost as a consequence of liberalization, increasing energy or increasing efficiencies in a more competitive market that has slow-tracked investment in the low-price environment. So also here, governments must build back better and can do this faster by working together. So, dear Ivan, that's where I would like to leave it for the moment. Thank you very much. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Christoph. I mean, and thank you for two things. First, for sticking to the time allocated in a very efficient way. And second, because of the kind of insights and data you have provided to us. And for me, there are two key messages from what you say. The first one is that regaining investor confidence is critical. It's critical if we really want to avoid all the issues we are mentioning. And second, and you say that very vividly, access to transparent energy market data is vital for reliable market signals and investment in resiliency in order to enhance energy security, market stability, and what you describe as an orderly transition in the energy sector. So, having said that, I would like to ask you a question before we switch into the next presenter. I think we are seeing a growing dislocation between OECD energy and climate policies with the prior signals that interconnected market fundamental shape. So the question will be, what is the role of evolving ESG criteria relative to market data and price signals? How they are affecting that?
I think indeed ESG standards are obviously evolving in many regions. The EU, the US, China, green financing entered in the G20 under the Chinese presidency in 2016. I think we have to avoid that we create different systems. Much more policy cohesion is necessary here. And I think there's also a risk that ESG might get too far ahead of the game and become leading instead of guiding. Because I think here, indeed, we need to ensure that these criteria remain anchored in market fundamentals, which are, of course, kind of like read by the data that we here at the IEF try to obtain. So maybe that's a first answer. We can develop this later further. Yeah. Thank you.
Definitely, we'll talk more about that during the discussion between the panelists. But I mean, your point links very well with the next presenter, Cornelia Meyer. Cornelia Meyer is the chairman and CEO of MRL Corporation and chief economist at LBV Asset Management. I know she's a person that has a point of view, and she expressed that in a very vivid way. So I like that. I like that a lot. And she's going to talk about the impact of ESG investing on oil markets, and particularly looking at the interconnection between the E and the S of ESG. So Cornelia, the floor is yours.
Ivan, thank you very much, and good afternoon to everybody. And I've been very obedient, as I rarely am, and I'm sticking not to 2 slides but to 3 slides. So I've been. My cousins would say you're a miracle worker to get me to be obedient. And I'm talking. I didn't put many numbers into the slides because they keep on the ESG side. They keep on moving. So I took the numbers where we have the numbers that we can use. But let us first slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay. Let us first come to a few home truths. right? Because it's very often when you come from an oil industry angle, a lot of politicians and a lot of, NGOs think that you're the bad guy and you you want to pollute the world. We all want to save the planet. We all have children. We all have great grandchildren, and we all want them to live in a good thing. So everybody wants to save the planet. Just how we get from here to there is the question. But there have been a few truths that have been created. The IEA's roadmap to net zero, it has created new realities. It's very controversial, especially in GCC countries. But when you see that after the IEA having released it a few months back, you saw 4 of the biggest asset managers who together manage about $6 trillion writing a letter to the 68 biggest banks saying, unless you show us that you adhere to those principles, we will no longer deal with you. That's real pressure on those banks. And that brings me to the next point. It's increasingly more difficult to fund hydrocarbon projects. And there is also a lack of, we all say we need to go to greener energy. We all want more wind. We all want more geothermal and whatnot. But there's a nice English saying, there are many ways to skin a cat. It's not just the focus on the new energy sources. It's also the focus, a lack of focus on incentives on for removal technologies. When you look at CCUS or also at the circular carbon economy, they're very important things that are happening there. And there's just from the ESG community, and especially from lawmakers, when you talk to lawmakers in Europe, especially, which I do quite a bit, there's just not enough focus on that. And they said, oh, that's just funny games. It's not funny games. These are real things. And if you want to get to net zero by 2020, you need to look at all ways to get there. So this brings me to Joe and I were at the same conference, I think the last Thursday, virtually. And it brings me to the thing, somebody said there's something very important. We need to be conscious that net zero does not mean zero carbon. So it's a matter of how are you dealing with the carbon? Are you removing it? Are you storing it? What are you doing? And then you have the high oil gas prices, and they exacerbate the inequalities within countries and between the developed and the developing world. When you see now in a place like England, this winter, pensioners on a minimal pension will have to choose between food or heat. And that cannot be right in an OECD countries. At the same time, these very ambitious net zero targets, they are great. But if you're a developing country, if you're Nigeria, if you're Ghana, if you're one of those countries, you will not have the money to put in the infrastructure for electronic vehicles and things like that. And we have by 2050, 2 billion people more on planet Earth. And we at this point have about 850 million in energy poverty. So if we don't want to deprive people in those countries, we need to help them. And when I look at the carbon fund of the Paris Agreement, where the rich countries promised 100 billion a year to the developing world, and it's getting better. But last year, only 80 billion were paid up. So if the OECD and the EU and everybody is so serious about this, they need to pay up and help the poorer countries. So we will not get there. Can you press one more? Because then my takeaway comes up. Oops. So what that tells us is energy transitions is an imperative. We do need to get to net zero at some stage, be it 2050, 2060, but it's difficult. And I think people have underestimated just how costly it is. Next slide, please. Debt financing for fossil fuel. I looked at it. We say that ESG, it makes it harder to get money into the fossil fuel industry. And looking at it, yes, it's getting harder. But if you look from 2015 to 2020, it was $4 trillion that banks have lent to to the fossil fuel industry. However, when you look at fossil fuel and bank lending, or debt finance, how it came down, and how green projects, how that went up, you can see that we have met an inflection point where, especially for debt financing, it will become much, much harder for the fossil fuel industry. May I get the takeaway, please? It's increasingly more difficult to attract financing, especially debt financing. Now we go to slide 3. You see, I'm such a good girl. We go to slide 3. ESG between aspiration and reality. And I think that's sort of important to look at. When we look at the flow of funds, and I have the flow of funds, then I have reality, and then I have the E, the environment, and I have the S on the other side. You look at the increased focus on the environment in ESG investing, and there are more and more targets. But we would do well to have more of a unification of targets. And I know that the Future Investment Initiative is looking at that. The institute is looking at that and has a program going with the think tank in Paris. But what this means, it's easier to fund green projects. And we look at the development finance institutions, to my point of we need to help the third world to get, or the developing countries to get across the hump. Well, the DFIs urged to go over the last 2 years or so, they spent 30% of their lending into green energy. But they're urged by the IEF and by others to go to 50%. That makes it, on the right-hand side, looking at the S, that makes it very competitive to fund, between E projects and S projects. I want the world not to suffocate in CO2 emissions, but I also want children to be able to go to school, women to be empowered, and all of the other good things that the multilateral development banks are working on. I want those things to happen as well. So we're going down to the reality. So this is sort of the flow of funds and what it means. But the reality is that it's increasingly more difficult, as Christoph has pointed out, to fund oil and gas projects. That has an impact, and we've seen it has an impact on prices. All you need is the perfect storm. You need a cold winter in last year. You need lack of agreement between Russia and the EU, and storage will be low. You need China to also clean up its act and need more LNG, and therefore be in direct competition with the LNG imports of Europe. So that means it has an impact on crisis, and they're going up. What it also means is that as we've seen, it will be harder to attract debt financing, especially as so many wealth managers come out, big wealth managers come out against big oil. You will see that the NOCs, with their strong government link, are better placed to fund. And it also makes sense because whenever you see a natural resource coming towards the end of its use, it's the lowest cost producer that will survive the longest and will increase its market share. And we do expect OPEC to increase its market share again. But the numbers are all over the place. The IEA would, in its optimal scenario, only want 30 million or 20 million barrels a day consumed by 2030 or thereafter, whereas OPEC says, well, we will by 2050 go down to about 75 million barrels a day. So we are all over the place. The question is, how will we finance it? And again, there's insufficient focus on carbon removal technologies, the circular carbon economy, etc. Surely, if we want to remove CO2 from the environment, we can't just look at one side of the balance sheet. We need to look at the other side of the balance sheet as well. Okay, and then we have, what does it mean? And that's the thing that worries me the most. Focus on social ramifications is, as I mentioned before, the poor in the OECD are severely affected. Really, this is we may have a climate emergency, but we have a social emergency on our hands, and politicians will react because at some stage, 4 years from now, they will want to get re-elected. And there's just not enough, especially after the pandemic, there's not enough money in the till to finance everything. And then you have emerging economies which are left behind. I mentioned before the Green Climate Fund. Again, if the developed world is so serious about the road to net zero, they need to fund the Green Climate Fund to 100% or 200%, because it cannot be that we allow one part of the world to develop and the other part of the world is deprived from development. These are inequalities that are not helpful, and we've seen that COVID-19 has actually made the world a much more unequal place, and we want to rather reverse that trend. May I get the takeaway, please? So it's difficult to find the balance between the E and the S, and nobody has so far found that silver bullet, but we need to work on this ASAP, because otherwise, as I said, we don't just have a climate emergency, we have a social emergency on our hands, and that is not good for national or for geopolitical stability. And that would be it.
Fantastic. I really appreciate the angle you brought to the discussion, because in some cases we go full blast into addressing the climate challenge or the climate emergency, but because transitions are not being planned in an orderly way, we are ending up with so many undesired consequences that are going to affect the social side, the employment and the development of certain countries. So I appreciate you brought that angle. And especially because there are countries in Africa where the energy transition for them is just moving from darkness to light, So access to energy is also something that we should not forget in our thinking, But going back to something that you say that I think inspired me a lot, and I think is very important, is the social ramifications, So my question will be to elaborate a little bit more on what impact will the social ramifications of the right now, higher oil prices will have on how the industry is perceived. Because again, there is also a problem of perception, and the industry has been demonized a lot. And therefore, as a result of that, we have all these, I would say, perfect storm in front of us,
I would say it is a perfect storm, and it is a vicious cycle, because the higher the oil prices go, the bigger will the anger be amongst the general public. And let's not forget, especially in democracies, the general public matters, because they will get you re-elected. But the bigger the anger is, the more the people will blame the oil companies for the whole high oil prices, or the OPEC, the petroleum exporting countries, for higher oil prices. And we live in a world where at times I'm not sure I'm in the same world, because I will speak to people in the oil industry and we all bemoan, as Christoph did so aptly, that we don't see enough investment flowing into the oil industry. On the other hand, I will talk to some well-meaning press people and I will tell them, look, we need more investment. Oil, gas, especially also gas prices are so high because the sector is so woefully underinvested. And they say, oh, you're totally wrong. We just didn't move fast enough on renewables. And it's very hard to explain to them that renewables are great and we need renewables, but we also need base loaders. And especially if you're Switzerland or Germany and you say, okay, we want renewables, and oh, by the way, and I'm totally for mothballing coal-fired power plants. There should be no, but then at the same time you go out of nuclear energy, which in a case like Switzerland would be 40% of electricity production, and then you wonder why you get over a hump. So it's whilst in reality, people should realize we are where we are partly because we are so underinvested. The truth of the matter is, it will only get the anger and the groundswell against big oil, especially big oil, and especially oil exporting countries bigger. So, and it was very hard to focus politicians on differentiated thought when they have an upcoming election. You saw what happened we saw what happened during the German election, that, the Greens and the Liberal Democrats, they're not saying, but the young voted for them because they, wherever they were leaning, there is anger, and the anger will go towards the Green, and I think also and towards people who are not necessarily positively induced when regulating the oil industry.
No, you're totally right. And I think you raise another important issue, which is that we need to better communicate, and we need to better educate the politicians and the society at large. And that's something where, because if not, I mean, again, we are going to continue the demonization of the sector, a sector that, if I may, is committed to energy transition and to decarbonization, and a sector that is only producing what the society is requiring. They are requiring energy. So, but let's switch to the next presenter, Pedro. Pedro Miras is the Director of Institutional Affairs and Organizations at Repsol. He's also the Vice Chair of the OECD, and I hope I said it right, Policy Group on Investment and Responsible Business Conduct. And he's also a key person in the World Petroleum Council. So, Pedro, off you go.
Thank you very much, Ivan, and thank you very much to the IEF and Global Platts to have been invited to be part of this very interesting panel. You finished the last statement about demonization, and that we have to understand that this sector is the energy sector, and the oil and gas sector is a sector that has many things to say. I remember a few years ago that we were speaking about the three pillars. I don't know if you remember the three pillars in energy that were sustainability, security of supply, and economy. And in the last years, I have the feeling that we have missed two of the three pillars, and we are only focused on sustainability and going in this direction. But the reality is very, 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 very clear on that. Today, we have prices around $86 per barrel. And that 1 year ago, or even before the pandemic, no analysts were forecasting that we are going to reach this level of prices. And let me say that it's my opinion that we are going to jump over the 100. And also with electricity prices, we have now in the many European countries, especially in my country, but others too, have electricity prices that are more than 4 times the price that they had a few years ago. So don't forget that the reality is quite clear, and we have to focus in the three pillars that are sustainability, but don't forget economy, and don't forget security of supply. No? The second is we need investment, but we need to know where to invest. We need to know what is going to be the demand in the future. And you have mentioned the several scenarios of the IEA, the EP zero scenario and the business as usual. No? And even if we don't take care of the net zero, says that in 2015 we will be close to 26 million barrels per day. But even in the announced Platts scenario, that they say that we are going to have 70 million barrels per day, the world is going to continue needing oil. This is very important, and we don't have to forget this now. And in order to maintain this, we need investments. And this is a very key issue because what kind of investments do we need? And what is the amount of investments? Let me give you a couple of figures here. No? And the first is that if we want to go to the next zero scenario, that means that the investment that are needed for as an average for the period of 2026 and 2030 is going to be $4 trillion US. Nowadays, we have around 1/4 of this investment, and this is a figure that comes from the IEF report. So the amount is huge. The amount is huge, but the problem is that we need to know where to put this investment. And there are many things that are important to say. We're speaking about money. I think there is not a lack of money. The money is still there, but we need to have clear rules. This is my first message here. It is important to have regulatory stability. That this is something that is not clear, especially in many countries. That means that sometimes we think that we can all the time change the rules and saying, okay, we are going to this level, but not this level, not much higher the level or much lower. And that is very risky for those who have to put the money. So it's important to have regulatory stability. Companies and financing needs to know what is the scenario in the future, because they are going to put a lot of money. Second, it's important to have transparency in the things that we do and technology neutrality. This is very important because we don't know what is going to, if the future is going to be the net zero scenario, because it's a forecast for many years. But what we know is that we want to decarbonize the system. This is clear, even for the oil and gas company. We understand that we need to decarbonize. But what is not clear is what is going to be the path. And I'm sure that no one technology is going to solve the problem itself. Many technologies are going to be necessary. If we speak about oil and gas, let me say biofuels, hydrogen, many other technologies, and others that we don't know, and that probably will help in the future to be in this direction. So it is important to demand for the policymakers regulatory stability and transparency and technology neutrality, because if not, we are not going to have these 4 trillion millions that are necessary to go to this scenario of net zero. Let me say that the business as usual, not the scenario of announced pledges needs the half of the investment, but it's $2 trillion in the next 26 to 2030 as an average. So the amount is very important, but the money is not going to be raised if we don't have a clear scenario. And the last is, we can reduce these kind of things. We can reduce the amount of investment that we have to face by using several things that are starting, but that are going to be very important. First, it is important to have good interconnections. That's something that is very controversial. We are all the time speaking about the connections with the gas pipelines or electricity from one part to the other. We know a lot here in Europe about this, how difficult it is to create an interconnection. But this is important because this is a good way to balance the energy movement. Second, common codes, common standards. I think this is very difficult to reach, but it's important. It's important to work in order to have same rules, same standards, and this is the only way that energy can flow from one part to the other without jumping all these barriers. Let me say that many times it's not a question of money, it's a question of those kind of barriers. And the last, but not the least, good information. Someone has stated before that information is a key issue here. I do support this. It's very important to have good information because information can reduce the investment. If we now imagine that we speak about the security of the stocks. Imagine that it's a clear tool to help in security of supply. No? And if we have good information where the stocks are, how it's possible to move from one part to the other, and to have common rules in order to calculate the transformation of these stocks in energy when it's needed, we can reduce the amount of stocks. No? Let me say that only OECD countries have around 4,500 million barrels stored as strategic stocks. That is more than 4,000 billion US dollar. We can reduce this, but we need good infrastructure, good interconnections, common codes, common system, and invest in information, intelligence, intelligence, and all these kind of things. But it's important to have good regulation, stable, and neutrality in technology. This is all I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pedro. You talk about a lot of very relevant things about technology neutrality. You talk about stable legislation. You talk about the lack of investments. And let me give you a figure. I mean, the amount of investment needed in the oil and gas industry, even in the more conservative scenarios going forward, is around $12 trillion between now and 2045. And the situation is that if we compare 2014 with investments in 2020, I mean, we are at 40% of what we used to invest in 2014. So we have a big gap that we need to address. At the end of your intervention, you talk about reserves and security of supply, and security of supply is extremely relevant, no? So my question will be around that, how do you think the oil and gas industry can optimize the strategic reserve systems? And right now, I mean, gas is the main issue in Europe and the strategic reserve of gas, no? But how they can optimize the strategic reserve system for it to be much more efficient and rapidly adjustable to supply and demand shocks as the ones we are having right now. We have both supply and demand.
Okay, thank you, Ivan. And I think that I pointed a little bit at the end of my intervention. First, we need to have common rules. It is important because imagine that this is something that is a good example is what the IEA does. No, for the OECD countries that are in the IEA, they have a common rule. So they have to calculate their stocks using the same conversion factors. So that means that all the countries are prepared for the same thing. Second is to have good interconnections. It's important to have, it's not only, the world is very global. It's not possible that every country has its own reserves all over the world and that's all. It's important to have good interconnections. And for me, the key is the information. I think that information can reduce investments in a very important way because sometimes the problem is not to have reserves. The problem is to move the reserve from one market to the other. So you have good information about consumptions, good information about the breakdown of this consumption, what kind of oil, gas, or diesel or gasoline you need in every market. You are able to optimize these reserves. And also to use intelligence, artificial intelligence, in order to have good movements of products if it's needed. It's much, and to have, of course, common rules and common codes is very, very important. So this is the way that administration have to work in. IEA is working in this direction, but IEA is only one part of the problem. You know that nowadays the consumption in the OECD countries is close to the half. I think now it's even below the half of the consumption of oil and gas in the world. No? So we are working in this direction, but the world is not only OECD countries. So it's important to continue working in this direction. This is, and we can reduce investments using this.
So thank you very much. I mean, you're totally right. We need to have much better information in order to manage our strategic reserve system. Probably, I mean, the IEA should start taking care about which are the strategic reserves of lithium, cobalt, neodymium, and all these new minerals that are going to be needed for the energy transition. But in any case, I mean, what you say, probably is music for the ears of IEF, because IEF, I mean, is the one real global organization, and one of the main areas of activities is sharing information. I mean, they have the JODI initiative. They are always comparing all the data or sources in order to compare and see how things are evolving. And on the other hand, we have Platts, and Platts is in that business, and they are providing us extremely relevant information, as we saw before with the Sentinel project, but with all the other information they provide for the sector. So these two entities, Platts and IEF, are really working on improving the data transparency and data availability. And it's a great transition to the next presenter, Herman Wang. Herman from Platts. His main area of coverage is OPEC and Middle East energy, and he's an expert on OPEC dynamics. No, so I would like him to focus on OPEC's long-term game and how it's positioning itself through the ESG movement, and you can see everything is interlinked, and with COP26 coming up. Herman.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Ivan, and thank you to Joe and the whole team at the IEF for hosting us here, the very kind words that you gave us. Yeah, I mean, in terms of OPEC right now, heading into COP26, it just seems to be a bit of a blame game going on, you know, with the current energy crisis. And, you know, perhaps some OPEC countries seeing this, the confluence of the energy crisis and the COP26 as you know, an opportunity to do some finger wagging about the preparedness of some of these consuming countries that are complaining about high oil prices. You know, of course, you know, if you're a consuming country, you're hoping that this energy crisis is transitory. But you know, for OPEC, it's a chance to kind of show that they still matter. You know, a lot of obituaries have been written over the years about OPEC and now they're OPEC plus, about whether or not they're still relevant in the markets. You know, OPEC is saying that we're here to you know, ensure the stability of supply, and this is you know, a key moment in the energy markets. Of course, a lot of this is being led by natural gas and coal and other non-crude commodities. But you know, I guess on the flip side, you know, if oil prices are getting too high and they stay high for too long, we know that high prices tend to encourage more investments in alternatives, and this is potentially an existential threat to OPEC. So they have to get this balance right. You know, this is a and for now, just, you know, from the signals that we're getting from a lot of these OPEC plus ministers, they think they are kind of on the right path with this. I did have a couple slides to show. I don't know if you can bring those slides up at the moment, or am I supposed to do my own slides? All right, why don't I do my own slides then here? All right, so what I wanted to do with this slide here is to talk about our periodic table of oil, which is you know, a project that we've been working on here, and we plotted, you know, 150 crudes around the globe in terms of their specs of you know, light, heavy, medium, sour, sweet. And what I've done here is I've filtered out the Middle East crudes in this, and you can get this on our website. If you go to Platts.com, search for periodic table of oil, you can see that most of the Middle East crudes that I filtered out here, they skew towards the medium heavy range and the sour range. And there's a lot of implications for this as we look at oil supply and you know, looking at the long-term game, what Ivan, you asked me to talk about here, you know, as ESG investing picks up, or even in the context of oil security, as we talk about in the Sentinel with disruptions, and you know, what Pedro is talking about with strategic reserves and how consuming countries figure out how to get that security of supply in the case of disruptions. You know, a lot of talk about what the future of oil demand is going to look like in 2030, 2040, 2050 as we go forward. And you know, a lot of these Middle East producers banking on their low cost of production to be that sort of last man standing. You know, this is, you know, when you look at some of the high cost production, whether it's in Canada, whether it's in the US shale patch, you know, a lot of these Middle East producers feel like they're pretty well advantaged in terms of that. So what does that mean going forward? If as you know, so Cornelia talked about the different scenarios for Middle East or OPEC market share. You know, what's the oil market going to look like in 2050, and how much of a share is OPEC. Well, OPEC's pretty confident that they're going to have a growing market share of crudes. And what this is going to mean is that the global crude slate is going to be heavier and sour. Especially if some of those high cost production in Canada and the US get shut in. This is going to have implications for refiners around the world, implications for strategic reserves. If you're a refiner, you're looking at these investments to build a new refinery in terms of decades. So how do you plan for that? And how do you, this is the, we provide this data here so you can look at this and you can filter out for all the different kinds of things on this periodic table, whether it's OPEC plus production, African production, North American production, kind of see what the properties are and where the implications are from a policy perspective and an OPEC production perspective of how this will shake out in the global oil market. Paul Sheldon talked a lot about Iran sanctions. Well, Iran, a lot of those Iranian crudes are again in that medium heavy sour category. So if those are kept offline, that's going to require perhaps the Saudi Arabias, the Iraqs of the world to step in and provide some of those barrels if demand keeps rising in this post-COVID world. We're trying to get to that post-COVID world, not quite there yet, but as demand, keeps emerging from that pandemic, where are those barrels going to come from, especially in Asia, where that demand growth is happening. So I think there are a lot of implications for OPEC, and a lot of OPEC. A lot of talk of OPEC as OPEC against the world, OPEC versus U.S. shale. Well, there's also a lot of intra-OPEC and now intra-OPEC plus competition for market share, and so, a lot of these crudes that are right next to each other here on this periodic table that we've compiled, they've got similar properties, which mean they have similar customers, and it's going to be a battlefield. I guess what OPEC might hope for, in a future scenario is if there is peak demand at some point, 2040, 2050, and the entire market shrinks for crude, but OPEC market share increases, there's enough of a pie for everybody. But, as we all know, that transitions are never quite linear. And so it's going to be disruptive, and it's going to be, who is going to be well placed among these producers to grow that market share and be well placed in that, which leads into my second slide here. As we lead into COP26 with this ESG momentum growing for investment decisions, carbon intensity driving a lot of these investment decisions. We've already seen some IOCs pull back from some of these projects, some of the more technically challenging projects due to ESG concerns, and I think there is some concern among these national oil companies about stranded assets and trying to make sure that they get monetized in time in these peak demand scenarios. Well, Platts, we're trying to look at this and put a price on things because we are a benchmark agency. But how do you get when these investment decisions come? We talk about oil in terms of API, gravity, sulfur content, all these different specs. Well, carbon intensity, should that be another spec that's talked about when you're looking to drill a well and explore a prospect? And can we put a price on that? Can we put a value on that? And as we know that sometimes when you have these investment decisions, to have that market-based signal to drive that decision can make it easier. So what we've done is we've taken the carbon intensity, life cycle carbon intensity of these crudes from wellhead production down to transportation to storage, and we've plotted them here on this a chart here, and we've picked 14 crudes to start off with as our beginning point. And you can see in some of the crudes here that the Middle East, the Ghawar field, I think it's 18.07 there, right in the middle of that brown rectangle there, which roughly middle of the pack, decently good in terms of a carbon intensity score. And then on the higher end, you have the more carbon intensive production. So you have in the, I don't know if it's a salmon cover there, that color there, 50.71, that's Kirkuk crude. And then on the high end, Canadian Cold Lake, very carbon intensive crudes. And so what we do is we take those carbon intensities and we compare those, and then we calculate a premium, carbon intensity premium based on the value of voluntary carbon credits, you want more information on the methodology on this, I can certainly point you to the people who are working on this at Platts. But the idea is that these ESG investing is probably not going away. Now there needs to be a balance of it, and that's what these OPEC oil producers would say, and what Cornelia's point is, and Pedro's point, and a lot of these that we've talked about here, is that if we want security of supply and we want to smooth out this energy transition as much as possible, I think oil and gas have a role to play, and these pricing decisions, can factor in. So I think it's an interesting time right now, just to kind of sum up my points for OPEC to go into this COP26 meeting. As I mentioned, it's coinciding with this energy crisis that we're seeing right now. High oil prices, you're getting a lot of complaints from consuming countries, the US, Japan, India, asking OPEC to produce more oil, which is, the irony in the case of the US as they try and push more of that environmental investing and trying to get off of their dependence on oil. But in the short term, you can see the dislocation that some of this has caused, and whether that's poor policy planning, whether that's, in Europe, renewables didn't quite boost the energy supply that perhaps was forecasted. Strategic reserves play into all this. This is all coming to a fore in COP26, and I think the message that you're going to hear a lot from these Middle East producers is that you can't plan for an energy transition without oil and gas. It's got to be a more orderly transition, and we're here to play a role. I think that's the message you're going to hear in COP26.
Thank you very much, Herman. I mean, you did a great, you answered my question, so I don't need to ask you a question again, because you really answered it a perfect way. And also I should appreciate the fact you do have been linking and creating linkages between the different interventions of the previous panelists. So that has been great in that sense, no? So now let's switch to some topics for discussion. And I have 3 topics I really would like to discuss with the panelists. The first one is around, I would say, risk premiums, no? And in the first presentation or the first session, we discussed a lot the geopolitical risk premium and whether it's going to evolve positively or negatively and so on. And I think through this panel, we have discovered a new risk premium coming from the energy transition, no? So we have you say about a carbon intensity premium, Herman, but I would say we could say the energy transition risk premium. So what do you think? The 4 panelists, what do you think about these 2 risks, the geopolitical, the energy transition risk premium? They are going to increase. We are going to be able to manage them. Are they overlapping? How do you think about this?
Ivan, I'm quite happy to take that question from the perspective of geopolitical risk. I think that you've got to look at fiscal break-evens of some of the major oil producers, and we talk a lot about fragile countries and fragile security. You have the core in the Gulf, which are wealthy countries with large foreign exchange reserves, large sovereign wealth funds. They're insulated. These are resilient countries. The core of the GCC are in a better position to capitalize from energy transition, but also to absorb some of the both political shocks but economic shocks that undoubtedly will be put onto major oil producers. It's the satellite producers. It's the more vulnerable, the fragile producers that where you are going to see a geopolitical impact as a consequence of energy transition. If that leads to lower demand, if ultimately it leads to lower prices as the world transitions and phases out fossil fuels, then it is the countries like Nigeria, like some of the other African producers. It's countries like Iran, some of the more fragile Middle East producers in North Africa, where many of the issues that we've discussed today will be polarized, I think. And I think it's a subject, actually, it's great that you raised it, because it is a subject that is largely ignored, is what is the geopolitical risks around, in a physical sense, around energy transition.
Thank you, Andrew, for stepping in. I think Pedro is raising his hand. And then Cornelia.
Okay, thank you, Ivan. Now, a couple of things. Regarding geopolitical, I am not going to say many things. This is something that is always on the table. You take what happens 100 years ago, there were political risks, geopolitical risks. And now we have geopolitical risk. And in the future, we will have geopolitical risk. So the only I want to say is that we have to be prepared for this, have is resilience enough to face all these kind of things using the tools that we have. So I'm not going to explore about what are the geopolitical risks now. But about energy transition, I would like to continue speaking about this. In my opinion, this is an important risk. But it's linked to the technology that is going to face this transition. In my opinion, what happened, we all agree that CO2, we have to decarbonize the system. I think it's something that there is no discussion. Even in those oil, gas companies that are more traditional, they understand it. We understand if we can be part of this, that we have to work in this direction. But the risk is when policymakers say that the way to do this is this. They don't know what is going to be the solution. We are speaking about a huge challenge with a lot of investments, with a lot of risk, with a lot of uncertainties. Please let the companies compete in a free and transparent system, and we will find the solution. Because all the technologies are going to be part of the solution. I think the oil and gas is going to have an important role in the next years. We cannot say that electrification is the only way, because what means is that to take out gas, to take out coal, and what happens that the prices are going up because the companies are not investing in oil and gas, and when it's needed, the prices are going up. And what can we do now when the oil rising? Is going to be close to the $100 per barrel, and electricity in Europe is more than double. So please, if we want to face this risk, take into account that the key is technology.
Cornelia?
Thank you very much. And I would actually like to agree with Andrew in terms of the geopolitical. I'm coming at this from the investor's perspective. And if you're the investor, if you have the transition risk and you overlay on this the geopolitical risk, well, you're going to be more sensitive to the geopolitical risk because you have the transition risk as well. So to Andrew's point, it will be harder for Algeria. It will be harder for more fragile states to attract the money, because not only do you have to deal with that geopolitical risk, on top of that you have to deal with the what I would call the risk of security of demand, because you don't know what the demand will be. You have this transition risk. When we come to the emerged economy, and when we come to the transition risk, again, when I look at investments into oil and gas companies, especially into sort of IOCs or independents in the West, you will find different sources of capital. It will be increasingly difficult to get debt financing because of the whole way that ESG is looked at by the major banks. We saw that in the two curves that I showed you that were interacted. So you will see more. That the strong economies in the Gulf will make sure that their companies are well funded, but for the Totals and the Shells and so on, especially with court cases hanging, you will see more risk capital moving towards it. So you may see more private equity and more specifically risk funds, but they will take their pound of flesh. They're not these are not friendly investors. They will make sure they get their return rates, which makes it again harder for those companies, to the point of we need to be agnostic towards technologies, yes, yes. Sadly, as long as, and again to the point, as long as we have, as long we don't have, as we have a change in law insecurities, in sense that, you know, the goalposts keep on getting moved, it's also more difficult to invest in there again, which brings us to the more risk. In other words, this whole hydrocarbon carbon economy will become more attractive to the more risk-based investor, and that's something I'm sure Herman will be very good at answering, because when we then look at the downstream, the upstream anyhow is more equity-driven, right? In an oil company, when you look at how they fund things, upstream is very much equity-driven. It's an equity risk. Production is sort of mixed, and downstream, when it becomes more like an industrial process, is more debt financed. My question is, where will the refiners get their debt financing from?
Good. Yeah, Cornelia, I think that's a really interesting point. And we've seen a lot of questions about the future of downstream expansion, even of some of these Middle East national oil companies. You know, they're a couple of years ago, it was a big push to build refineries overseas to capture demand for their crude. Now, you know, is there potentially an overcapacity and questions about the viability of some of these projects, especially in ESG world? You know, and I think, you know, also to your point, I think there's a risk of growing inequities within, you know, you talked about energy poverty. Well, even on the supplier side, I think there's growing inequities between producers, whether it's these, you know, these more well-off Middle East producers or some of the more distressed ones like Andy talked about. You know, we heard the Iraqi oil minister, you know, a couple of weeks ago, maybe a month ago, in an op-ed with Fatih Birol, the IEA, calling on people to help countries like Iraq invest in things like capturing gas flaring, and they're badly needed to you know, control this gas flaring and to meet their, not just their ESG aims, but also just from an economic perspective of just not flaring up all this natural gas that they could be monetized. And so, you know, Iraq, you know, probably can't do it on its own, and it needs outside help to do this. Are the other countries going to willing to step up? And if they don't step up, you know, what's going to happen with these different, you know, like I said, there's this intra-OPEC competition as well. And, you know, we think that the Saudi Aramcos and arguably the ADNOCs and are going to be relatively well positioned. You know, we see that even Kuwait Petroleum Company, Kuwait Oil Company, talking about a decline in their sustainable production capacity, whether that's due to mismanagement, whether that's due to lack of investment. You know, I think there are Algeria is another case, Angola, Nigeria. There's a lot of distressed oil producers out there. And where are they going to be in 10 years time, 20 years time? Of course, 10 years is a long time for the game to change in the oil market. You know, 10 years ago, U.S. shale was just getting started, right? And then 10 years before that, you know, U.S. production looked like it was in terminal decline. So, you know, there's a lot, you know, we're seeing increasing volatility in the market, and how these producers manage that volatility, and how they, you know, I don't envy trying to game plan for this energy transition, because it really is it's not going to be a smooth path.
Good. Thanks, Herman. And I know that Christoph is also willing to say something.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ivan, for giving me the floor. I think indeed the energy transition risk premium is something we would like to kind of like mitigate or balance or reduce, because it will translate in a peak in energy poverty, and that in turn will lead to further geopolitical issues emerging. So I think indeed the key is to achieve climate neutrality. We really need to acknowledge that we have to share prosperity first. And here I think there is an importance to kind of like link back to Pedro Mira's point, common cause. What is it we're trying to achieve? We're trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. If we look at the outlooks that we compare on an annual basis, we see that, you know, the share of fossil fuel in the energy mix is still going to be fairly high, and it's very difficult to bring that down. So we need technologies like carbon capture, use and storage, and a much broader and open-minded discussion about the way ahead. So ESG needs to do some rebalancing, I think. We have to ensure that it does not create barriers to trade. And most importantly, I think we have to ensure that it remains guiding and does not distort market signals.
Ivan, you're muted.
Sorry, I was saying that thank you very much, Jamie, for your comments. And I fully agree with you on the ESG needs rebalancing. I was looking at the comments coming from the web, and there is one that says the old IEA way is not necessarily appropriate for these times. And that's a good turning point to talk a little bit about IEF. No? If IEA way is not appropriate, what role can IEF play going forward to solve or address all the issues we have been mentioning today? Christoph, you may want to start as member of IEF, and then the others.
Thank you very much. I think the IEF, we here have our work cut out for ourselves. I think there really is a tremendous need to have a more inclusive dialogue and a more dispassionate dialogue that really focuses more on how market fundamentals and data evolve or become apparent, rather than prescriptive or the language of models alone. I think we need to listen. Of course, we need to listen to the models, and of course, the IPCC sixth assessment report is extremely important, and we acknowledge and embrace, by the way, the fact that all the scenarios point out at the importance of carbon capture, use and storage, circular carbon economy concepts. So I think we're very well aligned there. But we also have to listen to markets and simply the physics of energy technologies and the constraints they pose. So we are excited to be in this game, and we look forward to have a much more inclusive dialogue on that, bringing together perspectives from producers, developing countries, and developed regions. Thank you very much.
Cornelia, you are a regular attending the meetings of IEF. What do you think can be the role of IEF?
I think the IEF can be, and especially under this current leadership, can be the voice of reason, because you have the IEA, which is quite polarizing and polarized, and it comes also from a political. From a political perspective of who are these are OECD countries who sit there in the OECD, that they're accountable to their governments, and their governments get elected by people who go and demonstrate for Fridays for Future. So they have, you cannot take them into something that they're not. So but it's the IEA has quite a religious, let's put it this way, approach towards decarbonizing, and I think to the point of Pedro, we need to be agnostic to technologies, and we need to look at everything. And that's precisely where the IEF, with its largest membership of any energy organization, 71 countries, and you have OECD countries, you have Russia, you have really the whole world in there. You can sort of try to triangulate and become the voice of reason and find the common denominators, the build. It's about dialogue, right? Build that platform for the dialogue between the different proponents of the different ways. And if we need to, I think one of the big issues is people have stopped listening to each other. When you look at the people who are going towards net zero, they're not willing to listen to anybody who looks at something else. And other countries are not listening, other players are not listening to the other ones. So the IEF can build and is building and has the right leadership to build that platform.
Good. So the voice of reason, that's a good logo for IEF. Pedro, you are about to chair World Petroleum Council. What recommendation, what role you see for IEF?
I think IEF is a key stakeholder here for two reasons, in my opinion. First, is because it's the only organization that gathers not only producers but consumers, and this is very important because we have the both sides of the coin. I would say in the future we are not going to speak about consumer and producers, but energy countries, and it's very important for the world to have IEF in this role. Probably I would recommend, it's a personal opinion, that it's interesting to have more participation of the companies. It's my opinion. It's a general statement. And the second, you have Jody. You have the information. You have standards to gather information, and this is the future. As I told, as my opinion, and we are going to make a more secure system for energy if we are able to use good information, digitalization, and intelligence, artificial intelligence. And you have given the first step using Jody. And so for those two reasons, I think it's important. And let me say another thing. It says we are speaking about security of supply and stock of oil and gas and energy, but don't forget about those minerals that are very important. There is an important report from the IEF speaking about what are going to be the necessity of lithium, graphite, cobalt, nickel, and other. So the world is changing. The world is changing, and we have to bear in mind this kind of things. But of course, the IEF is in the right position to lead this process.
Herman, any comment or?
No, I mean, just other than to echo all the other people here, that the nexus of the producer-consumer dialogue, I think, is hugely important going forward.
Okay, good. So we need to close the session. Before we close, I would like to ask a question to be answered in one sentence, a headline, a tweet. That is now quite common, no? So the question, before you start answering with a tweet, one sentence only. What is the major challenge we are facing to ensure oil market security? So if we start with the same order, I mean, Christoph.
Cohesive or rebalancing ESG governance. Yes.
Good. I hope someone takes notes of all these tweets. Cornelia?
We need to ensure, which is in line with what Christoph said, financeability of the sector and not a marginalization of the sector, because it's an important part of energy, of providing energy to the world.
Thank you. Pedro?
Regulatory stability plus neutrality in technology keys for the investment in the future.
Good. And Herman?
Yeah, I would say how to calibrate the short-term and long-term here, the short-term security concerns and supply concerns with the volatility that results in the market, with the long-term needs to try and invest. And I think that's a challenge going forward for both producers and consumers.
Good. So I think we have got 4 great headlines as a summary of our conversation. And now I hand over to Joe McMonigal so that he can do the closure of the event.
Well, thank you very much, Yvonne. If we were tweeting, we'd do an HT, a hat tip to Yvonne Martens for very good moderating skills here today. I want to thank everybody from S&P Platts that joined us and really presenting a very impressive tool. I remember when it was first unveiled and I saw it on Twitter and went to the site. I immediately told the team we needed to highlight it somehow, and I'm glad we were able to do this today, and maybe we can have follow-on events in the future. So I really want to thank everyone from S&P for participating, and our expert panelists on the last panel. Really very enlightening. I also took a lot of notes. Always interested to know how people think the IEF could enhance the dialogue, because there continues to be a lot of monologue out there, but not a lot of dialogue. And so we're very grateful for those suggestions, and certainly we'll take them to heart. So with that, I will thank everybody for watching the live stream and also in the webinar. Really appreciated and noted so many friends on the participant list. Thank you all for joining. And we'll see you again soon on the next IEF webinar.
Thanks very much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.